today is September 8, 2017, and tonight and tomorrow we are going to be looking at the Temple Scroll a bit. So before we begin, let us ask our Heavenly Family for guidance. Eloheinu, our mighty ones, thank you for love and truth. Thank you for the principles that you've shown us in this message. Please help us to understand them and to implement them. Help us in this meeting to advance in some sort of understanding of the document represented in the Temple Scroll. Help us to judge all things rightly and to understand their true importance, and to use whatever lessons we can learn from this in bringing about an end to selfishness in this world. Todah, thank you. We ask this b'shem tzemach, in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so for those of you who may not have been on our past studies talking about the Temple Scroll, I'll give a little bit of a recap as to what it is and why we're investigating it, and why we're investigating it now. So essentially, the Temple Scroll is an ancient document written in Hebrew, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's the longest of all the Dead Sea Scrolls. The scroll itself is about 30 feet long, so that's a really long scroll when rolled out. So it's a really interesting text, really important. It has a lot of parallels to what we find in the Pentateuch as far as the law of Moses goes. But this doesn't really have a story narrative to it, at least in what's preserved. It's mostly laws. And so it's pretty interesting. We've talked about it as being a potential text claiming to have been written by Moses, or at least claiming to contain some of the law of Moses. This is all part of what we're going to have to investigate. And part of why we consider it generally important to investigate is that we recognize that the first 5 books of, quote-unquote, the Bible, while they are typically attributed to Moses, they themselves do not claim to be written by Moses, and all of the evidence from within themselves shows that they were not written by Moses, even though they may contain quotations that are genuinely Mosaic. And I mean that in terms of Mosaic authorship, although there may be Mosaic elements in the other sense as well. So the Temple Scroll really is something that needs to be studied a lot more in general by people interested in studying the Bible. And since we have so many things to study, we haven't kind of buckled down and like, okay, let's all study the Temple Scroll as we have with the Community Rule. I mean, the best preserved copy of the Community Rule has 11 columns, whereas the best preserved copy of the Temple Scroll has something like 66 columns. So, as you can see, that would take quite a while if we were to go through it with as much thoroughness as we've been going through the Community Rule. So, really, we've talked about how the Temple Scroll is a text which will have to be primarily studied on an individual basis or in local groups, you know, unless there's something in the future that I do not foresee concerning our studies of the Temple Scroll. It doesn't seem like we're going to go through it all in detail together on the calls. But we will every once in a while come together to discuss it, and there may be enough study that goes into it on an individual basis. Like, let's say people really take it to heart to study it and find out that it's a product of divine inspiration. Well, it may end up becoming a very important text for us. And we've talked about that possibility in past studies. But the reason why we're talking about it tonight and tomorrow night is because this Sunday, a couple days from now, is what the Temple Scroll identifies as being a festival, an appointed time, divinely appointed by Yahweh, just like Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Day of Atonement and so on and so forth. Now, we don't know whether the Temple Scroll is something by which we are to conduct our lives, and so we are not keeping the feasts which it uniquely promotes. However, because we can't just study it all the time, we're just setting aside some time near the feasts given to it to study it, at least to some extent. There are plenty more times that we could be studying it. We could even be spending more time studying it than we will if we were to strictly keep to the appointed times pointed out therein. Like if there's the first day of the first month, we may not end up having that as a time where we are studying this text. There's also the wood offering festival, which, if I remember correctly, starts, I think, the day after the Festival of New Oil. So it would be this Monday. But it's a 6-day feast, and we are not, this year at least, going to be taking a separate study for each night to really study this out on the conference calls together. If some of you guys want to get together in your local area, or if you want to host a conference call study or start a Facebook group or whatever and be studying it in more detail, that would be awesome. That would be great. It would be awesome for people to do that. And eventually someone's going to have to do something like that, but we may not end up doing that all together on these conference calls. So the Temple Scroll talks about the feasts which are usually known among Jews and Christians who are interested in the feasts, at least. The feasts mentioned in Leviticus 23 and also Numbers 28 and 29. But in addition to those feasts, there are several others mentioned in the Temple Scroll, two of which are harvest festivals at 50-day intervals commencing from the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot. So you have from the Feast of Weeks, I'll start even 50 days before that. On the first day after the seventh-day Sabbath, which falls within the Feast of Unleavened Bread, there is the feast, or I guess it's not technically called a feast in Leviticus, it's the offering of the wave sheaf. It's the day upon which the wave sheaf is offered. 50 days from the offering of the wave sheaf is the day of Pentecost, or Shavuot. And then, according to the Temple Scroll, 50 days after Shavuot is the Feast of New Wine. And then 50 days after the Feast of New Wine is the Feast of New Oil, which is the one which, if it is a valid feast, is a couple days from now. And then after that feast, the Feast of New Oil, there's the Festival of Wood Offerings. And then it goes into the regular fall feasts, or the fall feasts with which we are familiar. I try to be careful with my terminology. I call these ones regular, but the ones that I call regular right now, the only reason why I'm calling them regular is because we are more familiar with them. But perhaps it's not best to call them regular. Likewise, I've called the feasts which are in the Temple Scroll yet not in the Pentateuch, additional feasts, or in addition to the feasts in the Pentateuch, but using that word addition may make it appear as though the Pentateuch existed first, and the feasts mentioned there were in existence first, and then someone later added feasts. But perhaps that's not the case. Perhaps they are not additional. Perhaps they are the original ones, and people subtracted festivals. I'm not saying that that's the case either, but why make statements implying one situation over the other when we don't know yet? And I recognize that I have made statements that do imply that, but I'm wanting to point out the flaw in my terminology in doing so, because, again, it could just convey the wrong idea. So, in any case, the Temple Scroll has a lot more to say other than what it says about feast days. It's not primarily concerned with feast days, although it does discuss them. And for tonight, I wanted to first just ask you guys if you guys have studied it. If so, what have you found? And, then we can kind of go from there. And if no one has studied it, we might just start reading some of it from the earliest preserved portions, and however that develops would be however it develops. So first, has anyone here studied the Temple Scroll since our last meeting? And if so, what are your comments on it?
Sorry, I haven't studied it, so I don't have a comment on it.
Well, that's fine. Thank you for mentioning that you haven't, though. And for anyone else here, if you could mention either that you have or haven't, that would be great.
Me and Ed have not.
Joy has not.
Lynn has not.
Trent has not either. Teresa, how about you?
Yeah.
No.
Not directly. Just I've been listening to a bit in some of the editing I've been doing.
Oh, okay.
We did discuss it a bit, but not enough for me to have studied into it.
Sure. Yeah. And so I will say that if the reason why you guys haven't studied it in this intervening period is because you've been too busy studying other things related to the message or proclaiming the message and all of that sort of thing, then that's totally understandable. We have a lot on our plate to study. And so I know that's why Teresa and I know for others as well, or at least for some others, that's the reason why. However, if there are any of you who haven't studied it for the reason that you just haven't really been studying much, then I encourage you to study. And for everyone who has been studying a lot, well, let's make sure to ever be advancing in our study and in our sharing of the truth and so on and so forth. And that's something that I'll mention actually a little bit before we get into reading this. And this is actually connected. I overheard Teresa doing some editing a little earlier today, and she was editing the new moon topic on Ode 33 and 38. And part of the emphasis of that new moon topic was to say that we really need to make use of the light that we have already been given, because it would not make any sense for our Heavenly Family to just continue to give us new light after new light after new light if we're not making use of the new light that they give us. So part of this is just, oh man, guys, seriously, whatever truth you know, start sharing it. if you don't feel equipped to share the message yet, the only way that you will become equipped is to start sharing what you already know. And seriously, that will advance you far more quickly. You will never be able to master the message and really, really know it and then be able to share it to others. So if you're waiting to master it first, it's not going to happen, and then you'll never end up sharing it. And you know what? You'll never end up mastering it either. A good way that Ellen White explained this principle is using the symbolism of Zechariah 4. How in order for the 7 tubes going from the bowl to the lamps to receive more oil, they must be continually putting the oil which they receive out into the lamps. If the pipe gets clogged and the oil is not leaving the pipe and going to the lamps, then it can't receive any new oil. So that's kind of a problem, of course. And it's just such a perfect illustration. And the lesson is that there's no way that we can continue to receive more truth unless we continually impart truth to others. If you don't impart it to others, you won't be digesting it properly. You won't be making room for more truth. And plus, imparting it to others will help you to understand it better yourself. Simply because when you're in a position where you need to explain truth to others, if you find yourself not fully understanding it, well, you're going to have to go and study it some more so that you do understand it and can explain it well. Or even if you kind of understand it, you might not be able to put it into words, and having to put it into words in different ways for different minds will help you to understand it better.
Just like today, you mentioned to me how you were working on a reply, or somebody had asked you a question on YouTube, and you at least mentioned to me how, you really appreciate having to answer various questions because it helps you formulate them in different ways, and and fine-tune how you're formulating the answer and that sort of thing. So that came to my mind as soon as you brought this up.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll even mention the specifics of that example just because it's a good illustration, and if it'll help you guys understand what we're talking about, then that could be helpful.
And another reason I think it's good for them to know that this is something that affects you as well is because I would imagine the devil would try to tempt people to think, oh, well, Trent, he already understands all this, and it just comes really easy to him, and da-da-da-da. Well, I couldn't do that, whatever. And so you grow and advance in the same way.
Absolutely.
That we all need to.
Yeah, I'm not some special exception to this, that's for sure. Just like, even though when Ellen White talks about this with Zechariah 4 and the tubes, which represents the ministers, the same thing, of course, applies to the pipes going from the branches of the olive trees into the golden bowl. If the pipe doesn't continue to put the oil out, it gets blocked up. It can't receive more either. So the same principle definitely applies. So first, I'll just mention the general truth concerning which someone asked a question. So basically, it's the idea that truth is simply what it is. It's an inherent principle of existence. Truth is just that which corresponds to material reality. And so God didn't make truth as though there was no truth, and then God made truth. So the idea of light and darkness, the idea of truth, the idea of morality. All of these things are principles built in. So God didn't create morality. Morality does not have its basis in God. Morality has its basis in truth. So we've talked about that a lot, and I've explained it like that many times. But someone commented on a YouTube video asking a question related to that slightly different way. So they said that, it seems like truth, or I think they said light and darkness just are. They just exist. And that the law of God, they were asking if maybe the law of God isn't really something that God just made and controls and so on and so forth and monitors, but it's just out there. It's more like a law of nature or a law of the universe. So that was their question. And so my answer is that is essentially correct. I hadn't quite thought of it in those terms, in terms of the law of God being basically like a law of nature. But the way that I thought to formulate the answer is essentially this. God's law is a description of moral realities in the same way that Newton's law is a description of physical realities. I hadn't quite formulated it like that, but being in the place where formulating it like that was the clearest way I could put it to explain that principle to another person, it helped me to formulate it more clearly in my own mind, and now I have a clearer understanding of it than I had before. So this is why it's so important to be sharing the truth with others. We have the example of the woman at the well in John chapter 4. And she was a Samaritan. She was not totally up on all of the messages that had come preceding the message of Jesus. As not being a Jew, she didn't accept the message of John the Baptist, even though most Jews didn't necessarily accept that message either. She didn't accept John the Baptist's message. She hadn't accepted the messages of Zechariah and of Malachi and of many of these other Jewish prophets. Samaritans basically just accepted the Pentateuch. They also had the book of Joshua, but they didn't really consider it a main, like quote-unquote canonical or anything like that. So they basically just had the Pentateuch as their scripture. Well, that's pretty interesting. And yet, when she heard Jesus and she came to believe that he was the Messiah, she didn't say, okay, well, before I go share this with my Samaritan friends, I better go and study all of the prophets leading up to Jesus and then make sure that I, can explain it just right and so on. No, I'm sure that she did after that go to study all the prophets, but she didn't wait to study it all before she shared. She went right away and started sharing with the people in her town and bringing them to the Messiah. So that's an example for us. Ellen White talks about the genuine experience that this woman had and how she couldn't help but share it with others.
And what was the message that she shared, that Christ was sharing with her? Get people thinking about that. Did she go out saying, hey, I understand the prophecy of la-di-da-di-da, whatever it is. I understand the doctrine of this, that, or the other thing. It was, there's a source of living water that when you drink of it, you will thirst no more. It was basically, right, the idea of a transformation of character, receiving new life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's fundamental stuff. It has to do with changing our character. And it doesn't require a deep knowledge of, a lot of theology or doctrine or anything like that. That's something that anyone can relate to. So everyone is encouraged to share the truth that you have. If you don't share the truth that you have, well, you'll miss out on more truth. It's the sort of thing, it's, use it or lose it. So anyway, those are some important things to keep in mind in terms of principle. Let's kind of change gears here now and begin to look at the Temple Scroll. But before we do, I think it's probably appropriate for me to ask if anyone has any questions or comments on what we've said so far. And if not, and you're ready to get into the Temple Scroll, just mention so, please. Thank you.
I just wanted to say I appreciate that description of Zechariah 4, the tubes, and it needs to just keep flowing. That really helps me to solidify that truth of sharing the message, sharing what you know already. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Heavenly Family.
I don't have any questions in general. I don't know about anyone else yet.
Okay, so we'll get into the Temple Scroll now. There are several translations of the Temple Scroll, of course, as one would expect. And the translation that Geza Vermes did does not include all of the material that is in the Temple Scroll. However, it does contain a translation of the best preserved columns. So this is the translation that most of us here have, and it's a decent one to start with. There is also the translation by Florentino Garcia Martinez and another person who, let's see if I can pronounce their name, Ebert J.C. Tigkalar. How would you pronounce that? Unfortunately, I don't
think I'd even try.
Okay. So
just spell it.
Okay, it's Tigchellaar. Most people just refer to this by saying Martinez. So unfortunately, the guy with the hard to pronounce name gets left out, and that's why I was like, I'm going to give it a shot because he contributed to this. And It's not his fault that his name's hard for us English speakers to pronounce. I'm not saying that he's not an English speaker, but obviously his name goes back to something else.
That's right.
So
we'll have to.
Sorry, can you spell that again, please?
Sure. Tigchellaar. And the translation is called The Dead Sea Scrolls Study Edition. It's a 2-volume set. It has Hebrew on the left pages and English on the right pages. It's a very good translation, pretty word for word in general, and it contains more than Gaze of Hermesh's translation. So it's a good one for the Temple Scroll as well. And then there is another one which is definitely better for the Temple Scroll, or at least in some ways better. It's more useful in some ways. Let me see if I can pull it up here quick. I only have it within Logos Bible software. Okay, it is called The Temple Scroll, An Introduction, Translation, and Commentary by Johann Meyer. And I mentioned it in our previous Temple Scroll studies 50 days ago, but I wanted to mention it again here, since it is very useful in some ways. The way in which I find it useful primarily is that where it has parallels to the Pentateuch, it notes them. And it's quite handy in Logos Bible software, because where it notes the scripture, you can just hover over it and it will show up in a little box. So, for an example, column 2, lines 1 to 4 of the Temple Scroll read, "For it is terrible what I will do to you, ... Behold, I will drive you out before the Amorites, ... ites and the Perizzites, ... Jebusites." Okay, and then they put Exodus 34:11, and this is what it says: "Obey what I am commanding you this day. I am going to drive out before you the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite." So there it's very much so parallel. You have this, I'm going to drive out before you the Amorite, the something that's missing. You have probably the Canaanite and the Hittite. And then there's the Perizzite, which is partially preserved. The Hivite is not preserved in the text. And then you have the Jebusite. But all the preserved portions agree with this text. And so, most would say either the Temple Scroll is using Exodus, or Exodus used the Temple Scroll. So it's very useful to have those parallels noted. So that's why I would definitely recommend this translation for anyone interested in the Temple Scroll. And probably even better would be the Princeton Dead Sea Scrolls Project translation of the Temple Scroll, though that would be more expensive. I don't have a copy of it myself, and so I can't say what its features are and how it might differ from this one, and whether they note every scripture or not. But that would be a good one. And then there's the, I'm pretty sure there are several other translations of the Temple Scroll. So in any case, I think we will start with column 2. Now that is not preserved in Giza Vermez's translation. So for the first part, you guys probably won't be able to follow along. Let's see. Oh, maybe it is there. Okay. Yes, he does actually include part of column 2 up till line 15 or so. And then, rather than going to column 3, he goes to column 13. So you guys will be able to follow the first part, and then it will cut off. But I'll pause at the end of column 2. So again, there was more to this at the beginning of the scroll, so we don't have the very beginning. So let's start reading now, and our goals are to simply find out what this says, what the claims are that this text makes, and then we'll try to judge whether or not it is true and what its uses are and what they are not, and so on. So, Heavenly Family, please guide us as we read this. Would someone like to read that whole column 2 section here of the Temple Scroll?
I will.
Thank you.
Behold, I will make a covenant, for it is something dreadful that I will do to you. I myself will expel from before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. Take care not to make a covenant with the inhabitants of the country which you are to enter, so that they may not prove a snare for you. You must destroy their altars, smash their pillars, and cut down their sacred trees, and burn their idols with fire. You must not desire silver and gold, so that you may not be ensnared by them, for that would be abominable to me. You must not bring any abominable idol into your house and come under the ban together with it. You shall detest and abominate it, for it is under the ban. You shall not worship another god, for Yahweh, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Take care not to make a covenant with the inhabitants of the country, so that when they whore after their gods and sacrifice to them and invite you, you may not eat of their sacrifices and take their daughters for your sons, and their daughters may not whore after their gods and cause your sons to whore after them. ...
Okay. Thank you for reading that. And of course, this does have some reconstructions that have been made in the text, which is quite useful. It makes it a lot easier to read with the parts within the square brackets. And a lot of the reconstructions have been made on the basis of the texts which parallel the Temple Scroll. So I'll just mention the texts that do have parallels here. So there's Exodus 34, verse 11, 12, and 13. And then right after that, Deuteronomy 7, verse 25. And Deuteronomy 7, verse 25, actually, the way it's worded in the Temple Scroll is in agreement with the Septuagint rather than the Masoretic text. And then Deuteronomy 7, verse 26. And then Ezekiel 34, verses 14, 15, and 16. So what that's like is like you have this passage from Exodus 34, verses 11 to 16, and spliced right into the middle of it is a section from Deuteronomy 7, verses 25 and 26. Another way to view that is that the Temple Scroll is original, and then whoever put together Exodus took parts from this section, and then whoever put together Deuteronomy took parts from this section. So anyway, those are some parallels here. Does anyone have any comments or questions concerning what Ed read here from column 2?
It's a covenant that's God's requiring, his people to do something. Like a lot of his covenants are, he's sort of giving a one-sided covenant, and you don't have to do anything to earn it. He's just offering it. It's yours to take as a free gift. This one, you have some actions you have to do.
True, definitely. Anything else from anyone?
I find that it's very cut and dry, serious, and there's just no leeway. There's no leeway for allowing any of this to, for allowing anything other than this to take place. I'm just getting that feeling. It's strict, it's to the point, it's specific, and it's serious.
Yeah, it seems like some very definite, uncompromising commands, for sure. Anyone else?
I think you might think maybe because there's so many different parallel texts that, that it would be, possibly redacted, but it flows so nice the way it is. It doesn't seem like it would be that way at all.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, it could be interpreted either way for sure. And that's something that the study of the Temple Scroll, I mean, that's got to be a big part of it, to really compare it to the other texts which parallel it in order to determine whether this is using from them or whether they are using from this. Because if this is using from those other texts, well, then this is obviously secondary. It's dependent upon them, and it certainly then would not, at least in every respect, represent a more original form of the law of Moses or anything like that. But if those other texts are actually making use of this, well, then that would be quite
notable.
Quite notable, yeah. I mean, that would be so significant in terms of the importance of the Temple Scroll. Is there anything here which might indicate when it was written or by whom?
It was written before the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, and the Girgashites, and the Perizzites, and the Jebusites were expelled.
Yeah, it certainly seems to be claiming either that or at least claiming to be recording words that were spoken before that time. And likewise, it says, take care not to make a covenant with the inhabitants of the country which you are to enter. Well, that's implying that they have not yet entered the country where there are these Amorites, Canaanites, Hittites, Girgasites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. So if we're to place this somewhere in connection with the stories as we have heard them, then this seems to be talking about a time when the children of Israel were not yet in the land of Canaan. So sometime in the Exodus or in the wilderness or something like that. Of course, we don't want to specify things that the text does not specify, or to make it mesh with other texts with which it may not inherently mesh. But obviously it does contain very direct parallels to other texts. And so because of that, there's a shared thought. It's clearly an Israelite text. It talks about Yahweh. It's talking about the children of Israel. So it's talking about a time when the children of Israel were not yet in the land of Canaan. And these various Canaanite tribes had not yet been expelled from the land. So, like I said, it could be that it's claiming to be written at that time, or it could be that it's claiming to talk about that time from a later time. So, just like in the Pentateuch, it says, then Yahweh said to Moses, I will expel from before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, etc., etc. That thing is in the Pentateuch, and it has the same words in pretty much the same way, but that writing, which is in the Pentateuch, doesn't claim to be written at that time. It claims to be telling the story from a later time, but the story is set at that time. So at minimum, this is set at that time, but so far we don't have the voice of a narrator. We don't have a narrative setting in which these words are placed. So the only indication that we have so far is that this is set back at the time before Israel entered Canaan, and we'll have to see if there's anything which indicates that this is a narrative telling from centuries after the fact or not. Any other comments?
I just find that it starts off with the first person, right? Like it's speaking, behold, I will make a covenant. I will do to you. I myself will expel. And then you get to line about 10, midway in line 10, and then it says, it's above line 10 too, but mid line 10 it says, you shall not worship another God, for Yahweh, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. So if it's first person God speaking, here it changes, doesn't it?
Yes, there it does change so that it is not Yahweh just saying I, but I will say that this section is within square brackets, so we can't say 100% for sure whether it says for Yahweh is jealous. It might say for I, Yahweh, whose name is jealous.
Can I say something real quick?
Yeah.
Even if it does go from first person Yahweh to second person Yahweh, there's passages like that in the Protestant or in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, where there's more than one Yahweh in the text being represented. So you have I, Yahweh, et cetera, and then talking about we'll send down fire from Yahweh or something like that, right? Yeah. I don't remember the text. You probably do.
Yeah, Genesis 19:24. That's a really good example.
Okay, right, of course. That's the one, Abraham with the three Yahwehs and talking about another Yahweh.
Yeah. So, anyway, I think maybe something that'll be interesting is, since I can kind of conveniently hover my cursor over these verses, I'm going to quote all these verses that parallel this column in order. And then you guys can follow along in column 2 as I read these verses, and you'll see whether there's, how much difference there is and that sort of thing. So first it'll be Exodus 34 verses 11 to 13, and then Deuteronomy 7, 25 and 26, and then Exodus 34 verses 14 and 15. I don't think they translated anything from verse 16. Oh, maybe they did.
It says only insignificant remains of letters from verse 16, or 15 to 16.
Yeah. I may end up reading it all anyway, just for the broader context. Okay. And I have it set so that I'll be reading from the NET. I would kind of rather it be from something else, but I'm not going to take the time to change that right now. Obey what I am commanding you this day. I'm going to drive out before you the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Be careful not to make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land where you are going, lest it become a snare among you. Rather, you must destroy their altars, smash their images, and cut down their Asherah poles. You must burn the images of their gods, but do not covet the silver and gold that covers them so much that you take it for yourselves and thus become ensnared by it, for it is abhorrent to Yahweh your God. You must not bring any abhorrent thing into your house, and thereby become an object of divine wrath along with it. You must absolutely detest and abhor it, for it is an object of divine wrath. For you must not worship any other god, for Yahweh, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. But be careful not to make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, for when they prostitute themselves to their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and someone invites you, you will eat from his sacrifice, and you then take his daughters for your sons. And when his daughters prostitute themselves to their gods, they will make your sons prostitute themselves to their gods as well. Okay, so that's going to the end of verse 16 of Exodus 34, and of course interjected in the middle was Deuteronomy 7, 25 and 26. So as you guys can see, there's a lot of parallel there, and I, of course, wasn't able to read along in the Temple Scroll as I was reading those other verses. So were there any significant differences that any of you guys noticed?
Trent, did you start off with saying, did it start off with saying that it was that the author, or the person talking, was talking to the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Hittites? I wasn't sure what I heard in the beginning.
The way it started is this: obey what I am commanding you this day. I am going to drive out before you the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
So anyone notice any differences, or was it pretty well the same?
Seemed pretty well the same to me. The Girgashites were missing from the list of those to be driven out, but I don't know that that's significant. But yeah, it seems mostly the same.
Yeah, I noticed the Girgashites missing too, which is kind of interesting because in the other translation of the Temple Scroll that I have, the Girgashites are not there. So I'm not sure exactly what that is. Okay, yeah, very interesting that it seemed pretty much the same. Okay, well, that's something to keep in mind. So it seems pretty straightforward in a sense so far, in terms of parallel content, we still have to determine the direction of borrowing or copying, but pretty straightforward. So it's set at a time where Yahweh is telling the Israelites that he is going to drive out the Canaanite peoples and, not to make a covenant with the inhabitants of that land, and they are supposed to destroy all of the idols and so on. So that's the basic idea so far. So now I'll read some from the next columns, and this is going to be fragmentary for a little bit here, but you'll get somewhat of an idea of the sorts of things spoken of in columns 3 to 12. And instead of saying ... every time there's ... I'm just going to pause. Which violet purple wool and red purple wool, all your enemies. House, in order to set my name upon it. In it silver and gold from all lands, and you shall not make it impure, but by bronze and iron and hewn stone to build, and all its vessels they shall make from pure gold. Cover, which is over it pure gold, fragrant incense, and the table. The bowl shall never move from the sanctuary, and its sprinkling bowls shall be of pure gold, and its fire holders to bring fire inside with them, and the candelabrum and the entire altar for burnt offerings, bronze pure, and the grating which is over bronze to see bronze, going to column 4. Emerge to are wide 4, and a terrace is between the sixth, a terrace, the width and the height of the, and you shall build the porch 10 cubits, and the walls and height 60 cubits, 12 cubits, 21 cubits, 20 cubits square, its half. Going to column 5, joined cubits, thickness 3, according to the measure of 28, and the timber work also, cubits is the total height, and 4 gates, of the gate 12 cubits, and the whole framework, lower and everything overlaid, and you shall make a porch in all. Going to column 6. Over cubits, 10 cubits is the total height of the framework, and gates to the upper chamber to 4, 12, 1, its doors, the lower and everything. Going to column 7. Not. Boards of wood, cubits and 10, 80 boards, over all, 100 in total 5 cubits. Its height and the cover which is above, its width and 2 cherubim, the other and extend wings above the ark and their faces, and you shall make a curtain of gold, artistic work, the curtain. Going to column 8. And 7, and 1 cubit, and you shall make 2, above the 2 rows, this incense to the bread to incense altar at your removing. Bread you shall put incense on it, not eternal for their generations, and this shall come. Column 9. From its 2 sides, on the one side 3, and its knobs 3, the entire shaft, these 3, and its snuffers altogether 2 talents of pure gold, all its lamps, and you shall give. And the priests, the sons of, shall prepare as statutes forever for their generations. Column 10. Gate shall be, above the gate, crimson. Above it, columns, purple, red, and the tops. Column 11. And on the day of the sheaf offering, the first fruits for the corn offering, and on the 6 days of tabernacles, and for the solemn assembly, inner. Column 12. Its dimensions, cubit. All of it, all, and its horns and its corners to it. So that's the end of column 12. So after going through these very fragmentary remnants of these columns, I think we can see why Gaze of Hermes didn't include a translation of them. However, I'm sure glad to have a translation of them, to read it and to be able to know what it was talking about here. I mean, it seems to be clearly describing instructions to manufacture some sort of temple. There was cherubim mentioning certain cubit lengths for different components of the temple. And it's interesting that also that it mentioned the wave sheaf offering and tabernacles and several different things. I sure hope that one of these days they find another copy of the temple scroll with these columns preserved.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, that would be really, really awesome for sure. So anyway, does anyone have any comments or questions on the fragmentary material from these columns?
I'm glad we have the Pentateuch.
Yeah, I'm glad we have the Pentateuch as well. Now, I will add to that, though, that I know that sometimes, just like with the community rule, how we've talked about how some might prefer 1QS because it's just better preserved and easier to read because it's better preserved. Likewise, some people might prefer the Pentateuch because it's just better preserved, thus easier to read, and not so trying. I know going through reading fragmentary stuff like that is like, oh man, this can be tough to do. And to be clear, Mary, I'm not saying that you're preferring the Pentateuch over the Temple Scroll, or even if you were, that it would be for that reason. But it just reminded me of that. Okay, well, perhaps there are no further comments or questions on that. I think that very fragmentary section is actually the primary reason why this is called the Temple Scroll, believe it or not. A lot of the Temple Scroll is not preoccupied with instructions on how to build the temple. There is more talk of the temple in addition to what we just read, but I think that's where the most detailed focus on the temple itself is, and unfortunately it's mostly lost in that section. This kind of reminds me of Ellen White's descriptions of faithful Christians throughout the Dark Ages risking their lives for just a little scrap, a little fragment of, like a line from one of Paul's letters or something like that, and how scriptures were just so precious to them. And a lot of people for a lot of time only had little fragments, and they would just treasure those fragments. I mean, imagine if that's all we had, these little fragmentary sections from the Temple Scroll. That would be a totally different experience for sure. We have what some have called an embarrassment of riches. So anyway, of course, going on into column 13 is going to be easier to read because there's so much more preserved. Yeah, there are a couple spaces with some dots here and there, but really not much. It's pretty easy to read from this point. Maybe we'll read the material from column 13, and at least the first paragraph in Geza Vermez's translation. And so that goes up to the point where it says, on the Sabbath days you shall offer 2 yearling rams. We won't get into reading that part yet. I'm thinking maybe we'll just read this next little paragraph, and that should only take a couple minutes. We can discuss it a little bit, and then we'll wrap up the call within the next 10 or 15 minutes. So would anyone like to volunteer to read this first section, which is the bulk of column 13?
I can read it. This is what you shall offer on the altar: 2 yearling lambs without blemish, every day as a perpetual holocaust. You shall offer the first in the morning, and you shall offer the other lamb in the evening. The corresponding grain offering will be 1/10 of fine flour mixed with 1/4 of a hin of beaten oil. It shall be a perpetual holocaust of soothing odor, an offering by fire to Yahweh. And the corresponding drink offering shall be 1/4 of a hin of wine. The priest who offers the holocaust shall receive the skin of the burnt offering which he has offered. You shall offer the other lamb in the evening with the same grain offering as in the morning, and with the corresponding drink offering as an offering by fire, a soothing odor to Yahweh.
Okay, thank you for reading that. So, any comments or questions on what it says there?
I have a question.
Sure.
So there's a lot there that's supplied. There, it's indicated by the brackets.
Mm-hmm.
Some long sections. Do we know where they're getting that? Is it from, like, is there more than one temple scroll document that was found and parts were preserved in other scrolls?
Okay, good question. Yes, there were other portions or copies of the temple scroll that were found, but I don't think that they preserve a whole lot. So let me actually see if I can find. Okay, so there's 11Q19. That's the one we're looking at now. That's the best preserved portion. Then there is 11Q20, which actually has a decent amount that is preserved from, looks like, what is that, 16 columns. So there's 16 columns, or at least partial columns, preserved from this other one, 11Q20. But the first column of it that's preserved starts with paralleling stuff from 11Q19, column 15. So what we're reading is 11Q19, column 13, and this one doesn't have parallels until what's column 15 of 11Q19.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also a little bit preserved in one called 11Q21, and it has some material that parallels column 3 of 11Q19, although this is quite fragmentary itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's not much.
Yeah. And I'm trying to remember if there's anything other than that. That might be it. Just those ones from...
So not in any other caves?
I'll have to look to see if I can find anything else, but I'm not remembering anything. The one thing that crossed my mind is if there's anything from Cave 1, but I don't think so. But I'm sure we could look it up. If someone is on the internet, they could type in Temple Scroll and go to a Wikipedia page, and it might even tell you how many fragments there were. But those are the three that I'm aware of, or at least that I'm remembering at the present time.
Yeah, anyway, that was my main thought. I just was wondering, it's an awful lot of supplied text. Where are they getting it?
Yeah, very good question. And actually, I'll read this from another translation, which doesn't give near as much supplied.
Mm-hmm.
And so you guys can hear more what it sounds like just going with what we actually have in the fragment. And again, where there are dots, I'll just pause. So that, and 10, you shall make, and doors, 1, overlaid, for it a door, of the blood for the people, without blemish, 2.
And that's TWO, like numerical 2.
Yes. Fine flour mixed, and its drink offering for Yahweh, of the burnt offering, like the cereal offering of the morning. You shall not, and on the Sabbath days you shall offer 2, and that's again TWO. So, I mean, that's quite a different experience reading it without any of the supplied sections, at least without most of them that are in Gaze of Hermesh's translation. But even with this and what I read, there are square brackets with some supplied sections, but these ones are probably more certain. Like here you'll have part of a word that's preserved some of the time. And so anyway, that's something definitely to keep in mind, that where you are dealing with restorations, it may or may not be valid.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, for those reading the translation by Gaze of Hermesh, just by paying attention to the square brackets, you'll know which parts are preserved in the actual manuscript and which parts are supplied, or I should say restored, reconstructed by the translators.
Can I ask a question about columns 3 through 12 really quick?
Sure.
I was talking about the Pentateuch, and then I started thinking that, like, David was the one that had the instructions for the temple with the pillars and everything, right, going into the land, and that wasn't until way later that Moses didn't have. He had the instructions for the tabernacle, right, but not the temple. Am I remembering that right, or do I have my story straight?
Yes, that is correct. If we are to go with what is in the Pentateuch and in the writings that we have dealing with David.
Thank you.
Now, here, this is a question to be asked. Does the Temple Scroll actually claim to be a Moses document, or does it claim to be a David document? Is this supposed to be like the revelation of what was given to David in terms of building a temple, and basically the Moses stuff was still the tabernacle as we usually think of it? Or is it that this is claiming that Moses actually was given instruction on how to build a temple? So that would be quite interesting. Either way, we want to know what its claim is. I mean, it sure seems in this instance to be, you have this whole thing about the land which you are going to enter into and so on, and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and so on, not yet driven out. And then also there's another place which I believe is preserved somewhere here in the Temple Scroll. I don't remember where it is, maybe at column 40-something, where there's a place where it says, your brother Aaron. Now, if that's the case, and if this is one of the texts which has the tradition of Aaron being Moses' brother, then it may be indicating that the person is supposed to be Moses. Although that's something to look at more, to investigate more. I mean, not every ancient text viewed Aaron as Moses' brother to begin with, and we'd have to see if that, is it talking about Aaron specifically, or just the tribe of Aaron, or something like that, or the descendants of Aaron. Obviously, it's not like Aaron was one of the tribes of Israel, but, the priests in general. I mean, if it just says your brother Aaron, that sounds more specific, of course, to the individual. So that's something to study. Another thing to keep in mind in all of that is that there may have still been a certain amount of Canaanites in the land in the days of David. Archaeologists tend to say that the Canaanite conquest in the book of Joshua is basically totally unsubstantiated in the archaeological record, that there was no conquest of Canaan at all like what is reflected in Joshua. However, archaeologists do say that the image presented in Judges matches the archaeology perfectly, because in Judges you have a picture of a slow change over a period of like 200 years without like all the destructions of the cities and all of that. And some of the places which are said to be destroyed in Joshua are still there in Judges and things like that. And archaeology tends to agree with Judges over Joshua. So if that's the case, then it may be that some of those guys were still around at the time of David, and it could be that if this comes from the time of David, let's say that it is quoting some previous documents which do go back to Moses or have some genuine records of Moses, and maybe it's quoting some of that and then building upon it. Again, I'm not saying that that's the case, but putting forth hypotheses for testing. Anyway, we only have a couple minutes before our calling card is going to go out, and so I think we should end the meeting here for tonight, and then tomorrow night we'll come back on and continue discussing this. Would somebody like to quickly volunteer to thank our Heavenly Family?
I will.
Okay, cool.
Heavenly Family, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to study. And as we seek to come to a knowledge of the truth, I want to ask that you would please guide us, but through it all, to not lose sight of the fact that the important thing is to seek your righteousness and your kingdom. So help us to exemplify your character. We ask this in the name of Branch. Amen.
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 All right, love you all very much. We'll see you guys on the call tomorrow night. Shabbat.
Lila Tov.
Lila Tov.